Good evening. My name is Marina Stilianu, and I am a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many Indigenous peoples that lived on these lands, as well as the thousands of Indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879 as part of a federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of the Clark Forum, the Office of LGBTQ Services, the Women's and Gender Resource Center, the Department of American Studies, and the Law and Policy Program, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Vice Patrol, Revisiting the Policing of Gay Life Before Stonewall. As a queer person, I recognize the importance of understanding the history of my community. The battles to be recognized and accepted defined the subculture of the late 20th century and laid the path for the LGBTQ rights movement we see now. Activists such as Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera work to demand visibility, acceptance, and equality, and it is critical that we both recognize and continue their efforts to achieve full rights and dignity for the LGBTQ community. The rapid change in public perception of gay life, as well as the legality of homosexuality during the late 20th century, created a rich and complex cultural history in a relatively short space of time. The covert and frequently persecuted homosexuality of the 1950s erupted into the riots, parades, and furious pride of the late 1960s and early 1970s. This shift, launched by the Stonewall riots in 1969, was the result of several decades of bar raids, invasive surveillance, and the general persecution of LGBTQ-identified individuals. In order to examine the history of gay life in the 20th century, we must also examine how our legal infrastructure handled and defended the illegality of homosexuality in the United States. Our speaker tonight, Anna Lvovsky, will walk us through the legal infrastructure surrounding the criminalization of gay communities in the 20th century. Professor Lvovsky is an assistant professor of law at Harvard Law School. She has served as an academic fellow at Colombia Law School and clerked for Judges Michael Boudin of the First U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals and Gerard E. Lynch of the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. Her research focuses on the legal and cultural dimensions of policing, judicial uses of professional knowledge, and the regulation of gender and sexuality. Her research culminates in her book, Vice Patrol: Cops, Courts, and the Struggle Over Urban Gay Life Before Stonewall, which received the 2016 Julian Medsey Dissertation Award from the Association for the Study of Law, Culture, and the Humanities. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clark Forum welcomes differences of opinion expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speaker, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speaker and for everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. At this time, I ask you to please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. In the event of an emergency, please know that handicap-accessible exits are located on the west side of the building. And now, please join me in welcoming our guest, Professor Anna Lvovsky.
Hi, thank you so much to Marina for that introduction, and to the Clark Forum for inviting me, to everyone who made this possible, Todd Nordgren, Mark Aldridge, Sarah Markowitz. I'm deeply appreciative of your flexibility also to switching to a virtual event. I'm excited for an opportunity to discuss some of my research from my recent book, Vice Patrol, which examines the history of anti-gay policing in the United States. That history was a central part of gay life in the 20th century. Over the course of that century, legislatures across the country enacted and affirmed a host of laws aimed at suppressing queer communities, from sodomy statutes to anti-solicitation and disorderly conduct laws. Police officers, in turn, developed a range of invasive tactics to enforce those laws, spending late nights in gay bars, flirting with gay men on street corners, crouching behind peepholes in public bathrooms. My talk today will delve into some of these disturbing tactics, but I want to start with a more surprising story. In 1956 and 1957, a group of researchers in Michigan and Wisconsin convinced trial judges to speak with them confidentially about the police's anti-gay campaigns. They were surprised to learn that the judges had strong and strongly negative opinions on these practices. Asked about vice officers' undercover tactics, one judge in Detroit, a bit extreme, but not unrepresentative of his peers, grew red in the face. The vice squad's arrests, he decried, were atrocious, miserable, horrible, and appalling. It wasn't so much that this particular judge was especially open-minded about homosexuality. If anything, his attitude was one of pity and condescension towards these suspects. But as between homosexuality and police entrapment, the latter struck him as clearly far worse. In my talk today, I want to peer inside the vice squad, foregrounding a story that has typically stayed on the peripheries of histories of sexuality, bearing down on the daily realities and legal battles surrounding anti-gay policing, makes for a complex dive into a dark chapter of American history, one that's often heartbreaking and sometimes frankly absurd in its particulars. It also has much to teach us about the history of gay life and about the administration of the criminal law more broadly. The policing of gay life at mid-century, I argue, was never simply a contest about the limits of permissible sexual practices. It was also the site of an institutional struggle over the boundaries of the criminal justice system itself, the wisdom of the criminal law, the limits of ethical policing, and the authority of the courts. At the same time, it was the site of an epistemic debate about the very meaning of homosexuality, what same-sex desire meant, who gay people were, and who had authority to answer those definitional questions. These hidden debates, no less than the public's shifting views on sexual morality, shaped gay men's rights and freedoms at mid-century. So the years following World War II witnessed a dramatic expansion of urban gay life in America as queer men and women, emboldened by their experiences during the war, flocked to large cities in search of greater community. Less auspiciously, these years also witnessed a dramatic expansion in police surveillance. Certainly, laws both criminalizing gay practices and arrests for those practices predated the mid-20th century. Prohibitions against sodomy trace back to the colonial period and were supplemented by the early 20th century by a host of misdemeanors targeting solicitation, cross-dressing, and other queer social practices. Throughout those earlier periods, however, enforcement was relatively lax, generally targeting public sex acts or conspicuous shows of gender nonconformity, rather than cracking down on the broader spaces of queer social life. The rise of policing to the fore, the rise of anti-gay policing to the fore of the police agenda reflected a number of factors, including the growing visibility of urban gay life, a Cold War panic over gay employees in federal government, which lent the police's campaigns an air of political significance, and a series of moral panics about predatory sex crimes, starting in the late 1930s, continuing into the early 1950s. These panics led most influentially to the adoption of so-called sexual psychopath laws, which authorized indefinite detention of recidivist offenders and could be and were often invoked against gay men. Also significant was a more bureaucratic development, the police reform movement known as police professionalism. Hoping to increase police efficiency and streamline organizational function, police reformers splintered police work into increasingly specialized units, including vice squads, which in turn faced pressures to demonstrate their productivity through arrests. Visiting known gay cruising grounds, similar to visiting areas popular with sex workers, provided a reliable way for vice officers to maintain their arrest numbers. Vice squad surveilling gay cruising sites sometimes relied on relatively straightforward tactics, such as uniform patrols. For the most part, though, they developed a series of more surreptitious methods, from stealthy observations in gay bars to clandestine surveillance in public bathrooms. So this is a photograph of an officer manning a clandestine surveillance station in Mansfield, Ohio in 1962. But the preeminent weapon in the vice squad's arsenal was the plainclothes decoy. So the decoy was an undercover officer sent out to make himself an attractive target for criminalized activity, and a popular tool for the enforcement of essentially victimless morals offenses beginning in the early 20th century. In this case, decoys sent out to entice gay men were typically selected for their youth and attractiveness, and they canvassed a broad range of cruising sites, including bars, theaters, parks, bus stations, public bathrooms. You're looking right now at a photograph of a decoy officer with the LAPD in a popular cruising ground, Griffith Park in Los Angeles. Here's another officer from that same unit in the same park. Particularly in the first years following World War II, decoys' tactics were fairly simple. Officers approached suspected gay men, struck up conversations, and acted friendly or flirtatious, itself enough in some cases to make an arrest. Many also adopted more aggressive tactics. Decoys emulated common stereotypes of gay men, such as swishing their hips or speaking in high-pitched voices. Some took the first step of initiating sexual banter. Some spent extended periods of time flirting with suspects, drinking for hours at bars, or following men to their homes. In public bathrooms, vice officers often exposed themselves as a sign of sexual interest. So in Washington, D.C., one officer grew especially infamous for his aggressive techniques in public bathrooms. Having made eye contact, he would wait by the wall for a suspect to approach him, then either expose himself or at least pull back his coat to draw in the suspect's eyes and ask if the man wanted to take it before arresting anyone who reached out to make contact with him. In Los Angeles, similarly, multiple men described vice officers following them home, sprawling on their furniture, sometimes grabbing their hands to initiate sexual contact. The plainclothes decoy, in short, was a pervasive feature of gay life in the mid-20th century, and he was often deeply manipulative in his methods. Over the course of the 1950s, these tactics began to encounter two sources of resistance. The first came somewhat surprisingly from within the legal system itself. Historians of sexuality have focused on gay individuals' battles against the law rather than the internal operations of the law itself. And so they've typically portrayed anti-gay policing as a somewhat, though certainly not entirely, monolithic endeavor, commanding the shared commitment of police officers, prosecutors, and judges. In fact, the Vice Squad's campaigns inspired profound ambivalence in the criminal justice system, including among some prosecutors, but especially among the courts. Judges in the 1950s and 1960s looked askance at the Vice Squad's campaigns for a variety of reasons. Some simply didn't support laws criminalizing consensual same-sex acts. The decade following the publication of the Kinsey Report in 1948 witnessed a gradual liberalization of attitudes surrounding sexual behavior, especially among well-educated circles, which typically included judges. But even judges who weren't especially progressive in their views of homosexuality often pushed back for deeper institutional or pragmatic reasons. Some felt that vice offenses like solicitation, even if properly criminalized, were a waste of the police's limited time. Some grew impatient with what they saw as petty morals charges clogging their own dockets. Some, despite their distaste for homosexuality, sympathized with the individual defendants brought before them, especially the middle-class white men they rarely saw in their other cases. And it's worth lingering here on the unusual demographics of the police's anti-gay campaigns. To some extent, consistent with broader patterns of American policing, the Vice Squad's operations often fell especially harshly on poor men and men of color, both due to structural, economic factors, such as wealthier men's access to more private spaces, and due to the biases of individual officers who are often simply crueler to poor Black or gender nonconforming arrestees. At the same time, anti-gay policing is notable for the extent to which it diverged from this historical baseline. Laws targeting same-sex conduct were among the rare morals offenses that targeted and were enforced against activities common among white, middle-class, and wealthy Americans, bringing into court not only laborers or retail workers, but also lawyers, doctors, engineers, and bankers. In some cities, like Washington, D.C., political pressures actively focused the police's attention on wealthier suspects. So here you see a series of headlines reporting on arrests of fairly high-level government workers, federal workers. These demographic trends the extent to which these activities ensnared wealthier white men were key to driving judicial sympathies for gay defendants, who, after all, reminded judges of their own friends and neighbors. More than sympathizing with the men caught in the state's anti-gay laws, however, many judges took issue with how vice officers enforced those laws, the sordid realities of officers flirting in bars or exposing themselves in public bathrooms. At a time when judges grew increasingly attuned to the problem of police misconduct, outraged by widespread reports of police brutality during the Prohibition era and continuing abuses of Black suspects in the South, judges increasingly saw their role as policing the police. In context, some couldn't help feeling that however immoral a defendant's conduct might have been, vice officers' enticement tactics were even worse. As one Detroit judge, different than the one I first mentioned, confided to researchers in 1957, he had no stomach for cases where officers practically maneuver the defendants into a solicitation. And a key role was played here by a surprising development, the medicalization of same-sex desire at mid-century. Alongside a growth of gay communities, a central legacy of World War II was the ascendancy of psychiatrists as authorities on sexuality, especially so-called sexual deviants. Though ranging in their theories and their sympathies for gay men, psychiatrists depicted homosexuality as, at heart, a mental illness, the symptom of some deeper maladjustment, or a latent impulse to which anyone could fall in moments of unusual anxiety. The rise of this medical paradigm is typically remembered, understandably, as a profoundly corrosive development, something that justified public crackdowns on gay life and that devastated the self-esteem of queer individuals. But within the particular economy of the courts, its legacy was a little more complex. So first, the psychiatric model was critical in pushing judges to question the wisdom of criminal charges as a response to homosexuality. Many refused to impose jail time or even fines where they believed a suspect was better directed toward counseling. More specifically and more strikingly, that model fueled judges' revulsion at the police's enticement tactics. To the extent that judges saw defendants as psychologically vulnerable men who fell prey to a moment of weakness, they also saw police decoys as not simply rooting out, but actually breeding deviance, tempting otherwise normal men to succumb to their latent desires. And judges were directly encouraged in these beliefs by professional psychiatrists, not least employees at the psychiatric clinics funded to the sexual psychopath laws, who personally urged judges to dismiss anti-gay charges for that very reason. And here, unfortunately, I don't have a photograph, but notes from a field report where a doctor at one of these clinics brags to researchers about his own work encouraging judges to dismiss and acquit enticement-related cases. So in this sense, the medicalization of homosexuality, including the institutional infrastructure created by the sexual psychopath laws, was, although an undeniably sinister public influence, something that genuinely softened many men's experiences with the law. In theory, of course, all of these concerns were irrelevant. Whatever a judge's personal views, state laws criminalized a broad range of queer social and sexual practices, and even the most manipulative decoys rarely met the high legal bar of entrapment. But judges who balked at the vice squad's arrests developed a range of informal ways of resisting the ensuing charges. Some handed out light sentences, small fines, or brief terms of probation instead of the jail time urged by prosecutors. Some interpreted anti-solicitation statutes strictly to preclude what they saw as problematic arrests. Some imposed heightened evidentiary requirements like corroboration of a decoy's testimony. Some insisted on having charges reduced to lesser and less stigmatic offenses like trespassing. And many simply drew on their discretion over the sufficiency of the evidence to dismiss distasteful, if technically valid cases. So in New York, veteran defense attorneys learned to count on judges dismissing charges or acquitting defendants in cases involving aggressive police officers. In Detroit, one judge developed a practice of dismissing any cases brought by a decoy who either admitted having spent more than 3 or 4 minutes talking to a suspect in a public bathroom, or inversely, any decoy who denied that he had been trying to entice a solicitation to begin with. In the first case, he explained the decoy was too aggressive. In the second, the officer was clearly lying. So I don't want to exaggerate the impact of such judicial leniency. The majority of vice-related charges led to at least some type of misdemeanor conviction, and even reduced charges or acquittals often imposed heavy collateral consequences on the men involved. But such leniency was pervasive enough to capture the attention of prosecutors' offices, which in multiple cities began winnowing out gay-related cases or shifting their charging practices to lesser charges, expressly as an attempt to accommodate judicial humors. And it caught the attention of vice officers who complained privately and sometimes publicly that judges weren't, quote, holding up their end of the job. Frustrated, these officers didn't give up on arresting gay men, but they began to look for ways to adjust their practices to avoid the brunt of judicial scrutiny. At the same time, obstinate judges weren't the only thing leading vice officers to reconsider their tactics. A more direct pressure came from the gay community itself, and specifically the shifting organization of gay life in the 1950s. Fueled by both queer individuals' growing numbers and by their sensitivity to public and police hostility, queer life in these years increasingly cohered into organized communities, what sociologists and researchers would come to characterize as a distinct gay world with its own language, group ways, and codes of conduct. Long before mid-century, queer individuals had used subcultural signals to communicate their identities to kindred spirits, but in the 1950s, these codes grew more subtle. Linguistic codes expanded beyond familiar slang to include obscure conversational clues. Telltale fashions popular with gay men trended towards seemingly nondescript items like sport coats, polo shirts, sweaters, or tennis shoes. In cruising sites, men developed spatial signals and uses of body language to communicate sexual interest without any explicit conversation. Making eye contact, for example, or standing with one's back against the wall in bars, or tapping one's feet in public bathrooms. Outsiders remarked on the near invisible nature of these signals. As one attorney observed, sexual overtures in cruising grounds are often so subtle that a casual observer could not recognize them. The ability to recognize a veil overture almost amounts to a sixth sense. These codes were developed in key part to frustrate the enticement tactics used by police officers following the war, and they often worked in that regard. As one officer remarked in 1961, even when he flirted with suspected gay men, 3/4 were too roundabout in their proposals to give him grounds for making an arrest. To maintain their arrest rates accordingly, vice officers embarked on a new type of enforcement, what I refer to as the rise of ethnographic policing. Ethnographic policing aimed to evade the hurdles posed by gay men's insular pickup culture by mastering that cultural language itself, by making officers fluent in the very codes that gay men adopted to avoid them. Some officers learned those codes through informal methods, from their own observations to word of mouth passed down from older colleagues. Many also relied on formal programs of training and instruction. From academy courses to published textbooks, police instructors taught new decoys the contours of the gay world, including fashions, cruising codes, and slang often covered in glossaries that came with guides to pronunciation and usage. So again, here are 2 examples. First, an excerpt from a popular textbook used in California in the 1960s, reviewing gay fashion and slang. And second, here are some excerpts from a national textbook published by Prentice Hall, which may have published some textbooks that you yourselves used, at least in grade school, which came with photographic representations of popular cruising signals in bathrooms. This is focusing on eye contact. The second image focuses on tapping one's feet as a signal of interest. And many tidbits shared in these materials were deeply oversimplified and sometimes somewhat outlandish, but many were also frankly accurate. These were insights that were echoed by gay writers themselves and by progressive sociologists who studied gay subculture at mid-century. By the early 1960s, gay men themselves remarked on how well decoys blended into cruising grounds. As an early activist group warned in 1965, no matter how queer he may look, anyone looking for a sexual partner could possibly be a disguised police officer. And sometimes vice officers' attempts to pass at gay men might have been too convincing for their own good. In New York in 1960, 2 officers dispatched to investigate an invert takeover of a local YMCA men's room concluded their investigations by trying to arrest each other for solicitation. In DC, 3 vice officers were patrolling Lafayette Park when a member of the park police, seeing what he assumed to be an idling gay man, tried to take one of them into custody. Another DC decoy in 1960 was attacked by a gang of teenagers who were looking for a defenseless homosexual to rob and thought that he fit the bill when he entered the park. But that same camouflage also made vice officers extremely effective in the field. From parks to bars to bathrooms, officers recognized that gay men relied on subtle codes to initiate sexual encounters, and they mastered those codes as a tool of law enforcement. And numerous arrests in these years were precipitated, as gay men themselves often emphasized, by the use of deliberate and often discreet cultural signals, officers donning gay men's telltale fashions, dropping casual phrases with significance to cruisers, tapping their feet or looking through glory holes, sitting with their backs against the wall in bars. Years before the gay world's codes, fashions, and customs would become a subject of fascination for sociologists mapping urban gay life, those same codes emerged as a key weapon of the vice squad, directly underwriting their most effective enticement tactics. In itself, vice squad's intimacy with gay life echoed a broader trend among police departments in these years. Throughout the 1950s, police chiefs and reformers commonly lauded the officers' unique insight into criminalized communities, what officers described as a bond of common knowledge shared by policemen, but not generally known to the public. Officers often emphasized such expertise in court as a ground for judicial deference to their decisions in the field. Notably, however, vice officers who arrested gay men did not similarly advertise their often rarefied insights into gay life. To the contrary, even as decoys acquired a type of professional fluency in gay cruising culture, and as they used that knowledge to fuel their arrests, both police officials and prosecutors did their best to deny both the substance and even the fact of such cultural insight. As one officer in New York insisted in 1961, police tactics for enticing solicitations were passive, with plainclothesmen patiently waiting around for the suspect to make an advance. To illustrate how these dynamics played out in court, I want to focus on one example, the 1965 case of Robillard v. New York, arising from the NYPD's arrest of 4 men in Greenwich Village. The officer in that case came to the Harbor Bar wearing white pants, light sneakers, and a polo shirt, an outfit that he admitted he'd chosen to be in with the other patrons, and where he was eventually approached by Francis Robillard and 2 friends. After some friendly conversation, the officer lit Robillard's cigarette, admitted that he came to this type of bar often, and agreed to join the men at a party at one of their homes. The defendants then tendered a more explicit sexual proposal, and the officer arrested them for disorderly conduct. Recognizing a potential test case, the New York Civil Liberties Union spearheaded the men's defense, eventually taking the case all the way to the Supreme Court. And at all stages, the defense strategy rested on the cultural significance of the codes used in gay cruising sites. So as the prosecution told it, the defendants were clearly guilty of disorderly conduct, having initiated a graphic sexual invitation following, quote, an innocuous 5-minute conversation devoid of any conversation concerning sex. The men's sexual proposal is disorderly by this view, precisely because it was so spontaneous, an insult tendered out of the blue to a stranger at a bar. the defense painted a different picture. As the defense attorneys insisted, sexual behavior is known to consist of more than words, especially in gay communities where advances were tendered only if the other individual appears responsive, based on quiet conversation and the use of gestures and signals having significance only to other homosexuals. In that context, that the defendants were the first to verbally solicit sex wasn't dispositive. Just as a prostitute who dresses in the garb of her trade is guilty of soliciting, even though the customer is one who speaks, another brief went, so the officer's various signals were designed to invite sexual overtures from gay men like Robillard and the other defendants. At the Supreme Court level, these arguments split the justices' law clerks. One was compelled by the claim that by coming to a gay bar dressed as a homosexual, the officer had effectively signaled his openness to a sexual advance, frustrating the state's claims that Robillard had breached the peace. But other clerks refused to read as much cultural significance into the officer's conduct. Even if the decoy's attire and banter suggested some willingness to participate in homosexual activity, as Chief Justice Warren's law clerk concluded, that didn't change the fact that all of the advances were initiated by the defendants, who must have known that, and quote again, a total stranger might react violently to their proposals. Another law clerk quipped, if that's entrapment, then banks entrap robbers by virtue of their very existence. The clerk's memoranda revealed the cultural blind spots persisting among courts in the 1960s regarding the codes and customs that governed gay communities in the mid-20th century. Characterizing the defendant's proposition as a spontaneous invitation to a total stranger, the clerks acknowledged neither the extent to which gay men used fashions, postures, and conversational clues to identify willing partners, nor the extent to which such codes could begin a sexual negotiation before any overt words were spoken. Looking at the officer's conduct at the Harbor Bar, they saw at most a gay man drinking beer and answering some casual questions by the pool table. They didn't consider that gay men like Robillard might have seen anything else. And it was precisely that myopic view of the facts that made the prosecution's case in Robillard easy. Here then was the final virtue of the police's growing intimacy with gay urban culture. At a time when many judges continued to recoil against what they saw as overly manipulative decoy methods, the Vice Squad's ethnographic tactics didn't just evade the defenses of gay men. By trading in a language that most of the public lacked, they also evaded the scrutiny of the courts. Decoys who wore sneakers and sport coats in Greenwich Village, who leaned against walls in gay bars, or who slyly watched men in bathrooms, emulated a subtle language developed in an exclusive sexual community, a language whose utility depended on how few people knew it. And most judges, clerks, and jurors were simply not among those few. From arrest through conviction, the vitality of the Vice Squad's campaigns against gay men didn't just rest on the officers' own insights into the social organization of gay life. It rested on how very unusual those insights were, on the disconnect between how the police officers who arrested gay men and the judges who oversaw their arrests understood the very nature of gay life in these years. All right, so what do we learn from this history? First and foremost, the history of vice enforcement reveals the sheer effort that went into the regulation of gay life at mid-century. Precisely because gay individuals never presented the type of public hazard that police officials accused them of posing, vice enforcement demanded an immense amount of time, labor, and frankly, ingenuity, from mastering obscure cultural codes to spending hours flirting in bars and parks, to deliberately training younger colleagues how to gain the trust of cautious suspects. The depths to which officers went to entice gay men remind us of the paranoia and the profound demonization that drove the police's operations against queer life in these years, as well as the inherent absurdity of these campaigns. Beyond that, I see the history as supporting three key takeaways. The first has to do with disaggregating the law's interactions with police groups like gay men. Anti-gay policing at mid-century was part of a long tradition of morals regulation in the United States, pursued against the backdrop of heightened suspicions of sexual nonconformity as a threat to both public safety and national security. Yet even in that context, such campaigns were not consistently embraced by the agents of the law, nor even tolerated as an inevitability. They inspired trenchant disagreements over a variety of questions, from the propriety of punishing victimless crimes to the appropriate limits of police power, to the authority of trial judges, to the nature of contemporary cruising practices themselves. Motivated by their own institutional and pragmatic incentives, judges raised a variety of objections to the vice squad's campaigns and developed a variety of methods for resisting the ensuing charges. And vice officers, in turn, adapted their own tactics to accommodate judicial pressures, not always in the ways that judges had intended. Recognizing this institutional struggle doesn't change how gay individuals experience the weight of police repression in these years, but it does allow us to better understand the system that repressed them as a battleground over not only private sexual conduct, but over state power itself. The ebb and flow of the police's campaigns didn't just respond to shifting political pressures or to shifting ideological commitments to the regulation of sexual difference. It also reflected a set of less visible disputes over the proper administration of the law, all of which shaped, sometimes more and sometimes less intentionally, gay men's experiences of the law. The second core argument has to do with the intersection between anti-gay policing and public understandings of gay life. That is between the history of policing and cultural history. Throughout the vice squad's campaigns, certain familiar moments in cultural and public discourse about homosexuality emerged in surprising and often ironic ways. Commonly dismissed for its corrosive association of homosexuality with mental illness, the psychiatric view of homosexuality genuinely tempered the bite of the criminal law, fanning judicial doubts about both the wisdom of punishment and the ethics of decoy enforcement. Remembered for their conflation of gay men with predatory offenders, the sexual psychopath debates created an institutional infrastructure that actively softened the justice system's treatment of consensual activities. Commemorated as a valuable ally in the struggle to destigmatize queer men and women, the ethnographic recognition of gay communities as urban subcultures found some of its earliest and most effective practitioners among vice officers as a powerful tool for repressing gay life. The history of shifting public discourse about homosexuality and of shifting public understandings of homosexuality cannot fully be understood without a history of the police. At a time when cultural and professional authorities competed to define the nature of gay life, legal battles surrounding anti-gay policing were a critical arena for determining the relative power and the legacy of these different epistemic authorities. A site that brought the power of the law to bear in choosing which bodies of knowledge were authoritative, and one in which their impact was often unexpected. Legal historians have long traced the intimate link between public culture and the law, examining how shifting public discourse can explain the pace and the direction of legal change. The case of anti-gay policing reveals that the inverse is also true. Litigation isn't necessarily a microcosm of broader social debates, but a process that follows its own institutional pressures and norms, which can meaningfully alter those debates as they are translated into court. Just as an eye toward public culture may illuminate the tides of the law, so examining the inner operations of law enforcement can illuminate the ebb and flow of public culture, providing a key lens on how popular discourse and cultural trends affect the lives of our most heavily policed populations. Finally, the history of anti-gay policing exemplifies the curious politics of knowledge overhanging the regulation of marginalized communities at mid-century. Exposed to the intricacies of gay men's social and sexual practices, vice officers amassed often rarefied insights into the organization of queer life, and they used those insights to facilitate their arrests. Yet the ultimate power of their campaigns didn't simply depend on vice officers' own sensitivities to cruising culture, or even how efficiently they operationalized that knowledge on the ground. It depended in key part on the court's continuing blindness to that culture, on judges' failure to recognize the cultural realities that undergirded the police's arrest to begin with, effectively shielding the police's most controversial tactics from scrutiny. In a contested area like anti-gay policing, the power of the police's drives hung on an epistemic gap among the different agents of the legal system, a divide between how vice officers who arrested gay men and judges who evaluated their arrests understood queer social and sexual practices. From the rise of population statistics to records tracking criminal offenders, historians and political scientists have remarked on the state's imperative to amass knowledge as a form of governance, how the work of accumulating and standardizing information about regulated populations expands the power of the state. The history of sexuality and of homosexuality in particular has provided a key case in point for this phenomenon. But the Vice Squad's decoy campaigns also tell a different story. Those campaigns reveal how the state can maintain and even expand its power over police groups, not by popularizing any one paradigm of so-called deviance, but precisely by making room for multiple competing views, by fostering exploitable disagreements about the conduct being regulated. In a legal system administered by multiple agencies, which often disagreed on the value of the Vice Squad's campaigns, the power of the police's operations rested less on the spread of new insight about queer life through the criminal justice system than on its selective distribution among different agents, creating gaps that weakened potential checks on police power. Ultimately, the long, painful project of anti-gay policing in the United States was not just shaped by the legal system's divergent views of the wisdom of vice enforcement or its disputes about the limits of ethical policing. It was also shaped by the law's lingering disagreements about the very thing being policed, the law's many ways of understanding and misunderstanding the nature of gay life. That's an overview of the book, and I look forward to discussing with you and taking your questions.
It is now time for the question and answer session. Because this event is being recorded, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to reach you before asking your question. We reserve the first question for students, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the audience. We will now take the first question.
Hi. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to why the crackdown of policing was primarily on men and why women were sort of like ignored in this situation.
Yes, so absolutely. There were a number of reasons for that selective enforcement. Part of it had to do with essentially just the moral presumptions and biases that drove police officers' own work, as well as the perspective of legislators and other politicians, which was the sense that the sexual difference among men was more of a public hazard. There was a sense, as police officers saw it, or as they put it, that gay men were more likely to pursue their activities in public, or perhaps, again, they claimed, to make advances on strangers, while women tended to keep to themselves. Now, obviously, this rationale is ironic, if not almost comical, given the lens I've described that police officers went to infiltrate gay men's own internal circles. But one of the explanations given was essentially that women keep to themselves in a way that men don't. I think a more structural take on the same explanation, probably a little bit more purchase, is that just given men's greater spending power and men's greater access to the public sphere, it was in fact the case that a lot of gay men's social and sexual activities took place in more public spaces, in parks, sometimes in bathrooms, even in bars. By the 1960s, the late 1950s, there absolutely were bars at the very least that catered to queer women. But just given broader taboos against single women unaccompanied by men in the public sphere, it was the case that lesbians were more likely to socialize in more private settings. And the other consideration that's worth bringing up here is the limits on police personnel. An additional reason given for police departments, by police departments for avoiding enticement tactics in particular, for example, against queer women, is that this work was just too undignified. There were very few policewomen to begin with in departments in these years, and the sense that it would just degrade the gentler sex, the reasoning went, to ask them to role play in this way. Now, many male police officers found this work similarly degrading. Some officers either enjoyed this work or at the very least had no particular compunctions about it. Some really despised it, either because they thought it wasn't sufficiently important work, or because they thought it was sordid work that forced them into intimacy with a subculture they weren't interested in being intimate with. But at least at the level of police officials, there was a particular concern about asking women to engage in this work. And so one of the very few examples that I touch on in the book of a police department actually sending out a woman to engage in enticement tactics happened in Florida. And this wasn't a policewoman drawn from the police's own ranks, but a police department in Florida ended up paying a woman who had been convicted for sex work a certain salary to entice both queer women and some politicians that weren't to the police chief's liking. But you see, in that example, the extent to which police officers were just not comfortable asking policewomen, the few policewomen who were within their own ranks, to do this work.
Thanks so much for your presentation tonight. I just have a question in terms of the geopolitical position between the U.S. and Soviet Union at the time, and how that kind of affected the increasing, policing of gay life in general, and how does that kind of impact other legal aspects, for example, immigration law, if that makes sense.
Sure. So I think I missed one of the keywords. The position of what? The U.S.?
The geopolitical position between the U.S. and Soviet Union, and how does that kind of impact?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. What I will say is that this is something I address in the last chapter of the book. I was expecting perhaps to find a little bit more on this than I did. So to some extent, I mentioned at the beginning that one of the forces that drove the escalation of anti-gay policing following World War II was this concern about gay federal employees as national security risks. So this is very much a Cold War phenomenon. Essentially, soon after the war in the early 1950s, Senate Republicans are looking for a way to undermine the Democratic Truman administration. And they focus a little bit on the threat of communism, but they soon discover that it simply plays much better to the base to talk about the threats of sexual deviance than it does about the threats of communism. And so they essentially orchestrate this panic about gay and lesbian employees in federal government and the extent to which these employees might pose a national security risk. They're always at risk of blackmail. Now, the irony there, of course, is that these employees are only at risk of blackmail because they stand to lose their jobs if their identity is discovered. So it's a completely manufactured risk, even in theory. But in that sense, the policing of gay life in particular, and a certain political emphasis on domestic normativity and on shoring up the traditional American household is driven in key part by Cold War politics and the politics of distinguishing the United States morally from the Soviet Union, of essentially emphasizing and shoring up the purity and the traditionalism of the American household against the chaos that's threatened by the communist order, where women are more likely to be in the works, in the professional sphere, for example. So in that sense, I think anti-policing was broadly, in part, a Cold War phenomenon. I think the place where I have most expected Cold War tensions to emerge in the story is over this concern about undercover policing. So one thing that I expected and one question that I'm sometimes asked is essentially, to what extent was judicial skepticism of undercover policing driven by a revulsion against undercover police tactics as something that was a totalitarian or a communist police tactic? And I mentioned that this comes up in the final chapter. My final chapter looks at media coverage of gay life and anti-gay policing in the 1960s. And what you see is that when the media discovers these police activities, the media commonly uses the language of totalitarianism and anti-communism to denounce these police tactics. And these tactics smack of Gestapo tactics. So this is something that we would expect in a communist society, not an American free society. The notion of police officers going undercover and enticing these unwary men into crime. So it's certainly that association of police entrapment and totalitarian regimes lingers over this history. But curiously, it was never explicitly invoked or even implicitly invoked by the judges that I track. Despite the fact that I do review many other explanations that were provided by judges for their antipathy to this type of police work. And so I was reticent to necessarily assume that judges in the 1950s were driven by the same concerns that were driving public discourse in the 1960s, in key part because one of the key arguments I make in the book is that it's a mistake to assume that public discourse around homosexuality drove judicial views of this policing, because judges were actually very institutionally specific and had their own pressures. So I think those are the sort of the ways it intersects is I think most clearly in the Lavender Scare and more broadly in this imperative of shoring up the heterosexual domestic unit and in the ways that the public in particular associated undercover policing with totalitarian or communist policing. I think that those are the ways you really see the Cold War politics of the period inform this area of policing.
Hi, so I know that you mentioned that a lot of officers were sort of too good at their job, that they ended up running into like some fun little scenarios. But I guess my question, thinking beyond that, was, were there ever instances of policing within these vice patrols where other officers maybe thought that officers were sort of too good at pretending to be attracted to men?
Yes. Yeah, so definitely. That was, so it came up, for one, so one thing that I'll just disclaim from the beginning is it was a common rhetorical strategy within gay circles and later on within broader media circles to suggest that some of these officers simply had to be gay, that they were so well in tune to this culture, they were so good at what they did that they had to be gay. Statistically speaking, I'm sure that's right. I'm sure some of these officers were gay. I ultimately didn't find any particular example of one officer who I could confidently say that about, but certainly statistically, we can assume that had to be the case. Setting aside that wrinkle of the history, absolutely. One thing that attached to this type of morals work was the suspicion that it aroused within the police department, sometimes beyond the police department as well, but especially within the police department, which is, of course, a bastion of this very traditional, hyper-masculine ethos. So some police officers said that they would often be teased by other officers, but in a good-natured way, in a way that was essentially the type of ribbing you'd expect for many types of work. Some officers were much less equanimous in response to such teasing. Some officers seemed to be actually very uncomfortable and really resented the fact that their work painted them as suspicious within the eyes of their fellow officers. So there are anecdotes of officers really seeming to be genuinely embarrassed by these misunderstandings, and there are some anecdotes of officers shrugging them off and saying it's all in good fun. Beyond that, one of my core sources in the book, I actually put up his photograph. It was one of the LAPD vice officers I showed you. One of my sources for the book was actually a surviving vice instructor from the LAPD. And one thing that he mentioned, which was really fascinating, is that on the one hand, of course, police officers were generally not the most of a girl bunch, and they weren't especially positively inclined towards gay men. And particularly since their job was making these arrests, they had to convince themselves that they were doing important work, and the way they convinced themselves that they were doing important work was often by exaggerating the danger posed by homosexuality. At the same time, speaking at least for himself and his approach or his relationship with other officers in the LAPD in the 1960s, he said the officers who did this work often essentially developed a type of gaydar. He didn't use that term, but he said that they developed a certain cultural insight that led them to suspect that certain other officers in the force, whether or not on the vice squad, were gay themselves. And what he said was that they essentially never did anything about it because it seemed to them that so long as these officers were being good police officers and were being relatively private or circumspect in their personal lives, it simply wasn't their business. And so, I think one of the most difficult and ultimately intriguing thing about putting together some of the sources for this book was recognizing really the complexity and sometimes the cognitive dissonance that attended vice officers' own understanding of their work, that you could have a police officer who 100% was willing to defend the importance of his own work, entrapping gay men, but then who'd turn around and say, well, I don't want to ruin a colleague's career for a private matter like that. I think that was actually quite emblematic of the type of cognitive dissonance that attended a lot of this work.
Hello, this might be, I don't know. But you mentioned a Supreme Court case bearing relevance to vice patrol tactics and the like. What legal precedent was created by that case, if any? I'm sorry. So
the Supreme Court denied cert on that case. So that case really, the Supreme Court essentially never really touched on any of these questions. To the extent the Supreme Court really enters the story, there are certain broader precedents that bear on anti-gay policing. So the law of entrapment bears on anti-gay policing, and that was deeply influenced by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's shifting standards for what qualifies as a police search would also prove quite significant to clandestine surveillance tactics. So once a search was redefined as centered on reasonable expectations of privacy rather than a physical trespass on property, that allowed judges to find clandestine surveillance, clandestine observation of public toilets unconstitutional. And in the lead up to reconsidering this question of how to define assertion of the Fourth Amendment, there was one justice who directly cited a lower court case that dealt with anti-gay policing, and specifically raised it as an example of police overreach, of the type of really intrusive, outrageous tactics that the Supreme Court was allowing to take place by not redefining a search to be more defendant friendly, to be more restrictive of the police. But otherwise, the Supreme Court in these years never directly addressed the subject.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I was wondering if your research uncovered any role of any kind of organized religion in offering support for these campaigns of vice patrols, or just kind of trying to lend institutional legitimacy to current attitudes, et cetera?
So there's a sense in which, of course, prohibitions on sodomy and a lot of related behaviors trace back to certain religious prohibitions. I would not say that organized religion was something that was invoked really by any of the more political actors that I examined as a justification for this work, and that's in part because the period I'm looking at, which is really the 30s through the 1960s, is before the resurgence of religion as a major driver in American political life, which occurs more in the 1970s and 1980s. So while there are certainly certain religious foundations for the entire project of morals regulation of policing sexual morality, almost no one invokes it. I'm realizing there's one police officer, again in Florida. There's really a lot of outlandish stuff happening in Florida, and we're just looking at the tip of the iceberg here. But there was one officer who's reported on in Florida who's known as a true believer in anti-gay policing. That among the things, and he's very, very religious, and this is pointed as something that's unusual about him, that he's very religious. That's what drives his fervor for anti-gay policing. And one of the things he does is he actually, using his own funds, prints off booklets that essentially warn young men arrested for these practices that unless they repent, they're going to go to hell. And he hands these out to men who are arrested. But he's presented a little bit as a nut. He's presented as really on the outer edges of police culture. And one thing that's interesting about him is that he, although he's extremely committed to this work, he refuses to engage in clandestine surveillance work because, again, he's a religious man and he thinks that this is just too degrading. He doesn't want to watch such activities. So I wouldn't say that he comes out of the archives as representative of fellow officers. To the extent that religion comes up at all in the book, it's if anything, it's through the work of more progressive religious and religiously affiliated organizations coming out against police entrapment and pleading for greater tolerance.
Or two more questions?
Thank you so much for this talk. I have a question about what happens to ethnographic policing after this. They spend so much time developing these techniques and tactics and doing research. Where does it go?
Well, I think this is a period of time when ethnographic policing is being developed in other contexts as well. So I think I would say that undercover policing today, policing of a lot of drug offenses, gang offenses, anti-terrorist policing, probably all, I think, within this umbrella of ethnographic policing. But in terms of what happens to these particular specialists, essentially, so the book ends at the end of the 1960s, at which point this type of policing is really already on its way out. And it's on its way out for a variety of reasons, including greater legal protections for sexual privacy and greater concerns about abuse of policing more broadly, and the rise of a counterculture that's just more permissive towards sexual activity. But part of what happens is that I mentioned the final chapter looks at public discussions of anti-gay policing and of gay culture. Part of what happens is that when the public starts to learn more about these practices, and when journalists discover gay life, they essentially in key part discover gay life through police officers. So the media discovery of gay life is the apex of this form of ethnographic police expertise, because suddenly police officers, even if they can't claim credit for their insights in court, are at the very least claiming credit for those insights with journalists. And they're serving as cultural guides for journalists who want to learn more about gay life. But in the same way that judges weren't especially keen on police officers being paid to master queer cruising signals, neither is the public. And so when the public discovers that the police seem to have this unusual intimacy with a taboo sexual culture, this really becomes a scandal for police departments. At the very least, it becomes a source of embarrassment and a lot of pressure arising from that sort of public derision, really, public derision and contempt for the notion of police officers spending their time learning to perfectly emulate gay men. That's part of what leads police departments to step away from this practice. So I think that, the officers who master these techniques often stay in vice departments and continue to do other type of undercover work. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Elizabeth Hinton's terrific book From the War on Poverty, the War on Crime. But one chapter in her book looks at this extremely high effort, really dramatic, high production undercover sting that's orchestrated by the DC Police Department, where they essentially pretend to set up a pawn shop. And this is a way of just luring in a lot of underprivileged, mostly Black men to commit petty crimes in order to pawn items for sale. And that operation is organized by one of the officers who's one of the most prolific decoys for the DC Vice Squad sent to entice gay men in the 1960s. So these, I think the officers who show a talent, I would say, for this type of really surreptitious, manipulative work, they often stay within that area of work. They just shift to slightly different, they learn different cultures and then they emulate different cultures.
We have time for one last question.
Thank you for this fascinating talk. I was particularly intrigued by your observation that there was significant judicial distaste for the fact that white, middle-class, and professional men that were getting caught up in these enticement tactics. And I'm curious, what did your research turn up in terms of the demographics of the folks who were arrested, right? Was it that the white, middle-class, and professional men were garnering judicial distaste, but was there less distaste for the poor men and for the men of color and for men with more variant gender expression and diverse gender expression? What were the kind of demographics for the folks who were caught up?
Yes, so my evidence there is unfortunately more anecdotal. So there are some very clear cases of judges justifying their lenience in terms that are very highly classed or racialized. They'll say, well, in light of this defendant's terrific educational background, we think we should dismiss the case. There are also some cases of judges imposing different sentences or taking different approaches in seemingly similarly situated cases where on the one hand you have a middle class versus a poor defendant, or a gender conforming versus a gender non-conforming defendant, or a white defendant versus a defendant of color. It's a handful of cases, unfortunately, just because of the limits of what case records have been preserved. And part of what's happening here, of course, is the case records that have been preserved are those that go up in appeal. And the cases that go in appeal are those that have the best resourced defendants, and those tend to be wealthier and white defendants. So certainly there are anecdotal there's anecdotal data suggesting that judges treated these defendants very differently. At the same time, it's worth noting that to the extent that in a number of cities that I looked at, these judicial practices led prosecutors' offices to adapt office-wide policies of charging down defendants, or of not charging certain crimes, or of winnowing them out. That policy was then applied across the board. So in LA, for example, knowing the judges were really loath to essentially saddle these defendants with a stigmatic conviction, a conviction that entailed some accusation of sexual misconduct, the city prosecutor's office essentially switched to downgrading all first-time offenders to a non-stigmatized, non-sex-related offense, and that was then imposed against all. So I think to some extent this judicial pushback did put in place broader systemic practices that helped less privileged defendants. And in terms of, it's a great question about who was actually being arrested. And I don't, I don't have this statistical information, in part because it would just have been impossible to gather, given the many different charges that were used to arrest these men. And given that most of the charges that were used to arrest them were so vague and so broad that they also enveloped a range of other conduct as well, it was just, there was really no way to isolate a particular charge and know what it was being applied to. To the extent that I saw any attempt to quantify these arrests, there was a UCLA Law Review article in 1966 where in the appendix, the editors essentially said, we expected to find the arrest patterns were racially skewed, and to our surprise, they were completely proportional. So I'm not sure that I will rest on that to say, and therefore they were proportional, because I think, again, we have more circumstantial information that policing in LA, including moral policing in LA, was deeply, deeply racialized. But to the extent I had any evidence that was even attempting a broad analysis, it was somewhat surprisingly that.
Concludes this evening's event. Please join me in thanking Anna Lvovsky.
Thank you so much, and thank you for these terrific questions.